Hey everyone, and welcome back. Ever find yourself wrestling with a GUI, thinking, man, a checkbox would be the perfect fix right here?
It happens to the best of us.
Well, you're in the right spot. Today we're diving headfirst into Tkinter Checkbuttons. We're dissecting a seriously popular online tutorial to give you the know-how to code with confidence.
And the best part, you can jump right in even if you're brand new to Tkinter. We'll guide you every step of the way from the fundamentals to some pretty neat tricks. Who knows, we might even stumble upon some aha moments about solid GUI design along the way.
I'm always up for those aha moments.
Absolutely.
So the tutorial kicks off with a simple check button. Just a handful of lines of code.
Nice and straightforward.
They use this thing called int var, which, to be honest, always tripped me up a bit when I was first getting the hang of Tkinter.
It's a common sticking point, for sure. Think of int var as creating the special variable directly linked to your check button. When the box is checked, that variable flips to 1, and when it's unchecked, it's a 0, like a little signal flag to your program saying, hey, this option is on, or nope, this one's off.
Okay, that's starting to make sense. So we can actually use that 1 or 0 later in our code, right, to make something happen based on whether the box is checked or not.
Exactly. But here's where it gets really cool. Tkinter doesn't box you into just using ones and zeros. The tutorial also mentions string var and Boolean var, which can make your code way easier to read and much more user-friendly down the line.
Oh, how so?
Well, picture this. You've got a checkbox that says Enable Dark Mode. Instead of storing a 1 for on, you could use string var to store yes directly. Makes your code almost self-explanatory when you come back to it later, wouldn't you say?
Absolutely. It's like the code is practically commenting itself.
Yeah.
And Boolean var, that's all about syncing things up with Python's true-false system, right?
Spot on. It's all about picking the right tool for the task and choosing what clicks best with how you approach the logic.
I'm all about making life easier for my future self when I inevitably revisit my code. But how did we get these check buttons to actually do something? The tutorial mentioned something about events, right?
Right on. Events are like these messages your GUI sends out whenever a user interacts with it. Click a button, event. Type something in a text field, event. Tkinter lets you write code that listens for these events and then responds accordingly.
So it's like setting a trap. The user does something, and bam, our code springs into action.
Exactly.
The tutorial gave an example using .get to display the check button's value. Is that how we capture the event, so to speak?
Got it. That little snippet, c1v1.get, is basically asking the check button, hey, what's your status right now? And then you can use that value, whether it's a 1, 0, yes, no, or whatever you've decided to store to drive the logic of your GUI.
So if we're sticking with the dark mode checkbox example, .get, it tells us if it's checked, and then we could write the code to actually switch the colors, right?
Now you're getting it. It's all about connecting the dots between what the user does and how that translates visually in your application. Speaking of control, the tutorial dives into setting a default state for your check buttons.
Yeah, so with default states, it's all about setting the stage, right? Deciding whether a checkbox should start out checked or unchecked, giving users a pre-selected option or leaving things open for them to decide.
Makes sense. Like if you had a Remember Me checkbox on a login screen, you'd probably want that unchecked by default for security reasons.
Exactly.
Speaking of controlling things, the tutorial then jumps into this concept of chaining check buttons. Sounds kind of like a domino effect, but for GUIs.
You got it. Imagine you're putting together an interface for, say, ordering pizza toppings. Right?
Ooh, pizza, I'm following. You might have a checkbox for extra cheese, and if someone checks that box, you automatically want to enable another checkbox for double extra cheese. You know, just in case they're feeling really adventurous.
Okay, I see where you're going with this. So ticking one box could actually trigger another one to become active. That's a pretty neat way to guide users through choices, or even present them with options they might not have considered otherwise.
Exactly. It's about creating a smoother, more interactive experience. And the cool part is the tutorial shows how you can oft achieve this with just a single line of code, linking two check buttons together so that one controls the other. It's these small details that can make your GUI feel so much more polished and responsive.
It's all about those little touches. Now, something that's got me curious, we've been tossing around this idea of checking and unchecking boxes, but the tutorial also throws in these methods, select, deselect, and toggle. Are those just different ways of achieving the same thing, like more ways to skin a cat, so to speak?
Well, on the surface, they might seem like that, but each one has its own subtle strengths. Think of it as having a well-stocked toolbox, right?
I like this analogy.
You could try hammering in a nail with a wrench, but using a hammer is just way more efficient, more elegant.
I
Right.
see, I see. The right tool for the job and all that. So
Yes.
select and deselect are pretty self-explanatory. Check and uncheck, straightforward. But toggle. Now that one sounds like a pretty handy shortcut.
It's super handy. Let's say you've got a button that switches the theme of your app from light mode to dark mode. Instead of writing out all this code to figure out if it's currently light, then switch to dark, or the other way around, you can just use toggle. It flips the state no matter what it was before. Clean and simple.
Wow, I honestly hadn't thought about using it that way before. That's clever. It's these little shortcuts that make you feel like a true Tkinter wizard.
Right.
But before I get too carried away, the tutorial also mentions something called the indicator on attribute. They use a food menu example, which, let's be real, food always makes things more interesting. Food always makes things more interesting. So what's the deal with this indicator on thing? Is it just about making our check buttons look fancy?
It's definitely about the visuals, yeah, but it's more than just adding a little sparkle. You know how teacher usually shows that little box, it gets ticked or unticked for check buttons?
Yeah, the classic checkbox look.
Exactly. Well, Indicator on Kinder gives you the power to switch that up, change it to something else entirely.
Okay, so instead of a box, we could have, what? A button that changes color when it's toggled. Or maybe even a little icon that appears and disappears.
You got it. And the food menu example from the tutorial demonstrates this really well. It uses Indicator Icon to create this menu where clicking an item highlights it and the total price updates right there alongside it. It's still a check button at its core, but it looks and feels way more integrated with the overall design. So it's all about creating a more cohesive user experience. Instead of just having these generic checkboxes scattered all over the place, you can really make them feel like a natural part of your interface.
Precisely. And that's a key takeaway here. Even these seemingly small visual tweaks can make a huge difference in how users perceive and interact with your GUI. It's about going the extra mile to create something that's not just functional, but also genuinely enjoyable to use.
You know, I'm feeling pretty inspired to step up my GUI game right now. But before we get too carried away dreaming up beautiful interfaces, let's pause for a second. We've covered a ton of ground today, from the basics of creating check buttons to some really cool customization techniques. If you had to pick just one thing for our listeners to remember about working with Tkinter check buttons, what would it be?
Oh, that's a great question. Honestly, I'd say the most important thing is to always keep your user in mind. Even before you write a single line of code, think about how they're going to interact with your GUI. What choices are they going to need to make? How can you make those choices as clear and intuitive as possible? So it's about focusing on the big picture, the user experience, and not getting too lost in the weeds of individual widgets and attributes.
Exactly. A little planning up front can save you a whole lot of headaches down the road, and it'll lead to a far better experience for your users. And at the end of the day, isn't that what really matters?
Absolutely. Well, folks, we've reached the end of our Tkinter Checkbutton deep dive. Hopefully, you're walking away feeling empowered and ready to start building those interactive GUIs of your dreams.
And remember, the absolute best way to learn is by doing. So fire up those code editors, experiment with the examples from the tutorial, and don't be afraid to break things along the way. That's how you really figure stuff out.
Couldn't agree more. Go forth and create amazing things, everyone, and we'll catch you on the next deep dive.